In the summer of 2015, a 26-year-old graphic designer named Rachel Winters disappeared without a trace in the Tonto National Forest near Payson, Arizona. For 3 years her family searched, investigators followed every possible lead, and volunteers combed through miles of wilderness hoping to find even the smallest clue. But Rachel had vanished so completely that many began to believe she would never be found. Then in June of 2018, during a routine patrol in a remote section of the forest, 2 park rangers stumbled upon something they would never forget. Sitting against the base of an old ponderosa pine, wearing a torn green shirt and looking impossibly thin, was a woman who barely seemed alive. Her eyes were half open, her breathing shallow, and her body so frail that at first glance she looked like she had been there for decades. It was Rachel Winters. And the story of how she survived 3 years alone in the Arizona wilderness would soon become one of the most baffling and disturbing cases in the history of missing persons in the American Southwest. On June 14, 2015, Rachel Winters left her apartment in Scottsdale at approximately 7:30 in the morning. Security footage from her building showed her carrying a small day pack, wearing hiking boots, and dressed in a green cotton shirt and dark cargo pants. She had told her roommate, a woman named Jennifer Paulson, that she was planning a day hike in the Tonto National Forest and expected to be back by early evening. Jennifer later told investigators that Rachel seemed relaxed that morning, maybe even excited. She had been stressed from work for weeks and was looking forward to spending time alone in nature. Rachel was not new to hiking. Her friends described her as someone who loved the outdoors, who had grown up camping with her father in northern Arizona, and who knew how to read trail maps and pack the right supplies. On that particular day, according to the logs at the Payson Ranger Station, Rachel signed in at the trailhead for the Highline Trail at 9:15 in the morning. The ranger on duty that day, a man named Raymond Foster, remembered her because she asked about water sources along the route. He told her there were a few seasonal streams but advised her to carry enough water just in case. Rachel nodded, thanked him, and headed toward the trail. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. The Highline Trail is a well-known route that stretches for miles through dense pine forests, rocky ridges, and open meadows. It is popular with day hikers and backpackers, especially in the early summer when the temperatures are still moderate and the landscape is green. On the day Rachel disappeared, the weather was clear. The temperature hovered around 75 degrees, and there were no storms forecasted. Conditions were ideal. But by 10 o'clock that night, when Rachel had not returned home and had not answered any of Jennifer's calls or messages, her roommate began to worry. Jennifer tried calling several more times. Each call went straight to voicemail. She sent text messages asking if Rachel was okay, if she needed help, if she had decided to stay out longer than planned. There was no response. At 11:30, Jennifer contacted Rachel's parents, who lived in Flagstaff. Her father, a retired forestry worker named Paul Winters, immediately drove down to Scottsdale. By the time he arrived just after 2 in the morning, Jennifer had already called the local police. The officer who took the report advised them to wait a few more hours, suggesting that Rachel might have simply lost track of time or decided to camp overnight. But Paul insisted that his daughter would never do that without calling. He knew her habits. He knew she was careful. The next morning, a search and rescue team was dispatched to the Highline Trail. They began at the trailhead where Rachel had signed in and worked their way along the main route, checking every turnoff, every overlook, and every side trail that branched into the forest. Dogs were brought in to pick up her scent. Helicopters flew low over the canopy, scanning the ground with thermal cameras. Volunteers arrived in the dozens, spreading out across the surrounding area, calling her name, and marking sections of the forest that had been searched. For the first 3 days the operation was intensive. Teams moved through the forest in grid patterns, checking campsites, creek beds, rocky slopes, and dense thickets of manzanita and scrub oak. They found nothing. No footprints, no pieces of clothing, no signs of a struggle. It was as if Rachel had walked into the trees and simply ceased to exist. One of the searchers, a volunteer named Greg Palmer, later said in an interview that the forest felt unusually quiet during those days. He described it as the kind of silence that made you aware of your own heartbeat, the kind that pressed in on you from all sides. He said they searched places where no casual hiker would go, steep ravines, boulder fields, areas choked with deadfall and thorny brush. But there was nothing to find. On the 6th day the official search was scaled back. The incident commander explained to the family that they had covered an area far larger than Rachel could have traveled on foot in a single day, even if she had wandered off trail. The dogs had lost her scent within the first mile. The helicopters had seen no signs of distress. The conclusion, though unspoken, was that Rachel had either left the area on her own or met with some kind of accident so severe that it left no trace. Paul Winters refused to accept that. For weeks after the official search ended, he returned to the forest on his own, sometimes with a few friends, sometimes alone. He walked the same trails over and over, studied maps, spoke to other hikers, and searched places the teams had already covered. He put up flyers at every trailhead, every gas station, every rest stop between Payson and Phoenix. Her face stared out from those flyers, smiling, healthy, alive. But no one called with information. As the months passed, the case grew cold. The missing persons report remained open, but there were no new leads. Rachel's bank account showed no activity. Her phone never reconnected to any network. Her car, still parked at the ranger station, was eventually towed and returned to her family. By the end of 2015, the story had faded from local news. A few articles were written on the anniversary of her disappearance, but they offered no answers, only questions. Where had Rachel Winters gone? How could someone vanish so completely in a forest that was searched so thoroughly? Her family continued to hope, but hope became harder to hold on to with each passing year. In 2016, Paul organized a second large-scale search with the help of a non-profit organization that specialized in finding missing hikers. Volunteers came from across the state. They searched new areas, reviewed old reports, and interviewed people who had been on the trail around the time Rachel disappeared. They found nothing. In 2017, a private investigator was hired by the family. He spent months reviewing the case, speaking to everyone involved, and walking the trails himself. His final report stated that in his professional opinion, Rachel had either been the victim of foul play or had suffered an accident in a location so remote that it would take years, maybe decades, to find her remains. The family was devastated, but they refused to give up. Then in the early summer of 2018, something changed. On June 9, two park rangers named Clayton Hayes and Angela Briggs were conducting a routine patrol in a section of the forest about 8 miles southeast of the Highline Trail. It was an area that saw very little foot traffic, mostly because the terrain was difficult and there were no established trails. The forest there was dense, filled with thick underbrush, fallen trees, and steep slopes that made walking slow and exhausting. They were checking for illegal campsites and signs of wildfire risk when Angela noticed something unusual. At first she thought it was just a pile of old fabric caught in the bushes. But as they got closer, she realized it was a person. The figure was sitting upright with her back against the trunk of a large ponderosa pine. Her legs were stretched out in front of her, and her arms lay limp at her sides. She was wearing what looked like the remains of a green shirt, torn and filthy, barely holding together. Her pants were shredded at the knees. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks sunken, and her skin had a grayish tone that made her look more dead than alive. Angela called out, but there was no response. Clayton moved closer, kneeling down beside the woman. He checked for a pulse and found one, faint and irregular, but present. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Her eyes were half open, staring at nothing. He radioed for immediate medical assistance, giving their coordinates and describing the condition of the woman they had found. Angela stayed with her, speaking softly, trying to get any kind of response. The woman did not move. She did not blink. She did not acknowledge their presence in any way. It was only when Angela gently touched her shoulder that the woman's eyes shifted slightly, as if registering something from very far away. The rescue team arrived within 40 minutes, rappelling down from a helicopter because the terrain was too rough for ground vehicles. Paramedics assessed her condition on site. Her body temperature was dangerously low. Her heart rate was weak. She showed signs of severe malnutrition, dehydration, and muscle wasting. Her fingers were covered in old scars and calluses. Her feet, bare and covered in dirt, were cut and bruised. One of the medics later said she looked like someone who had been living in the wild for years, not days or weeks. They stabilized her as best they could, wrapping her in thermal blankets and starting in 4-line to get fluids into her system. She was lifted carefully onto a stretcher and airlifted to a hospital in Phoenix. During the flight, she remained unresponsive, her eyes open but unseeing, her breathing steady but shallow. It was not until she arrived at the emergency room that anyone thought to check her identity. A nurse noticed a small scar on her forearm, a detail that had been mentioned in the original missing persons report. Another nurse pulled up the old case file and compared the photo to the woman lying on the hospital bed. The match was undeniable. It was Rachel Winters. The news that Rachel Winters had been found alive spread quickly through the hospital and within hours reached her family. Paul Winters received the call just after noon while he was at home in Flagstaff. The voice on the other end belonged to a detective from the Phoenix Police Department, a man named Kenneth Larson, who explained that a woman matching Rachel's description had been discovered in the Tonto National Forest and was now being treated at Desert Valley Medical Center. Paul did not wait. He grabbed his keys, called his wife, and drove straight to Phoenix, barely stopping for gas. When he arrived at the hospital, he was met by Detective Larson and a hospital administrator who prepared him for what he was about to see. They told him that Rachel was alive but in critical condition. They said her body had suffered extreme trauma from prolonged exposure, malnutrition, and dehydration. They said she was not responsive and that it was unclear how much cognitive function she had retained. Paul nodded but did not fully absorb the words. All he wanted was to see his daughter. When he entered the intensive care unit and saw her lying in the bed, he barely recognized her. Rachel had always been a healthy, active young woman with a bright smile and an energy that filled any room she entered. The person in front of him now was a shadow of that. Her face was hollow, her skin stretched tight over her bones. Her arms were thin, almost skeletal, and her hair, which had once been dark and thick, was now matted and streaked with dirt. Her eyes were open, but they did not focus on anything. Paul approached slowly, his hands shaking. He said her name softly, then louder. Rachel did not respond. He reached out and took her hand, and for a moment he thought he felt her fingers twitch, but the doctors could not confirm whether it was intentional or just a reflex. Over the next several days, a team of specialists worked to stabilize Rachel's condition. Blood tests revealed severe vitamin deficiencies, particularly in B12 and D, which are common in people who have been deprived of sunlight and proper nutrition for extended periods. Her muscles had atrophied significantly, suggesting months if not years of limited movement. Her bones showed signs of stress fractures that had healed improperly, likely the result of falls or repeated physical strain. X-rays of her rib cage revealed old injuries, cracks that had mended on their own without medical intervention. One of the doctors, a trauma specialist named Dr. Lillian Cross, noted in her report that Rachel's body showed patterns consistent with someone who had been living in survival mode for an extended period. She had scars on her hands that looked like they came from digging or scraping against rough surfaces. Her feet were heavily calloused, the kind of thickening that develops over years of walking barefoot on uneven ground. Her teeth were in poor condition, several of them cracked or worn down, possibly from chewing on hard materials like roots or bark. But the most troubling aspect of Rachel's condition was not physical. It was psychological. She did not speak. She did not react to voices or touch in any meaningful way. Her eyes would sometimes follow movement, but there was no recognition, no emotion, no sign that she understood where she was or who was around her. A neurologist brought in to assess her cognitive state conducted a series of tests and found that while her brain activity was present, it was subdued, almost as if her mind had retreated into itself. He described it as a form of dissociative shutdown, a defense mechanism the brain uses when exposed to prolonged trauma or isolation. Meanwhile, Detective Larson began the process of piecing together what had happened. The location where Rachel was found was approximately 8 miles from the Highline Trail, deep in an area that had not been part of the original search grid. The terrain there was difficult to navigate, filled with thick vegetation, rocky outcroppings, and steep drops that made it nearly impossible to traverse without significant effort. Larson organized a team to return to the site where the rangers had found her. They wanted to see if there were any signs of a campsite, any belongings, any clues that might explain how she had survived for 3 years. What they found was both strange and unsettling. The area around the tree where Rachel had been sitting was relatively clear, as if someone had deliberately removed debris and branches to create a small open space. There were no signs of a tent or shelter, but there were several flat stones arranged in a rough circle a few feet away, and within that circle were the charred remains of old fires. The forensic team collected samples of the ash and determined that the fires had been made over a long period, possibly years, using only wood and natural materials. There were no matches, no lighters, no modern tools of any kind. Nearby, they found a shallow depression in the ground that looked like it had been used for collecting rainwater. The dirt around it was compacted and smooth, suggesting repeated use. A few feet from that, they discovered a small pile of bones, animal bones, mostly from rabbits and squirrels, along with the remains of what appeared to be bird carcasses. The bones had been stripped clean and some showed signs of being cracked open, likely to access the marrow. The investigators also found several pieces of fabric, torn and weathered, that matched the clothing Rachel had been wearing when she disappeared. The green shirt she had on when the Rangers found her was the same one she had worn 3 years earlier, now so damaged that it barely covered her torso. There were no other clothes, no shoes, no backpack. Everything she had brought with her on that hike in 2015 was gone, except for the shirt. One detail stood out to the forensic team. On the trunk of the tree where Rachel had been found, there were deep scratches carved into the bark. They were not random. They formed lines, grouped in sets of 5, the kind of marks people make to count days. The team counted over 400 marks. If each set represented a week, it meant Rachel had been keeping track of time for years. But at some point the marks stopped. The last set was incomplete, as if she had simply given up counting. Detective Larson tried to make sense of it. How had Rachel survived for 3 years in the wilderness with no supplies, no shelter, and no contact with the outside world? How had she avoided detection during the search operations? How had she found food and water in an environment where most people would not last more than a few days? He reached out to survival experts, people who had trained in wilderness endurance and understood what the human body could withstand under extreme conditions. One of them, a former military instructor named Howard Lang, reviewed the evidence and gave his assessment. He said that while it was theoretically possible for someone to survive in the forest for an extended period, it would require an extraordinary level of skill, mental resilience, and luck. The fact that Rachel had no prior survival training made it even more improbable. Howard pointed out that the location where she was found was not ideal for long-term survival. There was no reliable water source nearby, the area was heavily shaded which meant limited sunlight and warmth, and the wildlife was sparse. Most people in that situation would have tried to move toward a trail or a road, not stay in one place. The fact that Rachel had remained in such a remote spot suggested that something had prevented her from leaving. Whether that was physical injury, psychological trauma, or something else entirely, no one could say. Back at the hospital, Rachel's condition began to improve slowly. Her body started to respond to the nutrition, and her vital signs stabilized. But her mental state remained unchanged. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her face blank, her hands resting at her sides. Nurses tried to talk to her, asking simple questions, but she never answered. Her father visited every day, sitting beside her bed, speaking to her about memories from her childhood, about family trips and holidays and moments they had shared. Sometimes he thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, but it was always brief, gone before he could be sure it was real. Dr. Cross consulted with a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma and catatonic states. The psychiatrist, a woman named Dr. Naomi Fletcher, spent several sessions observing Rachel, noting her lack of response to external stimuli, her fixed gaze, and her overall withdrawal from reality. In her notes, Dr. Fletcher wrote that Rachel's condition resembled what is sometimes seen in prisoners of war or individuals who have endured prolonged isolation. The mind, she explained, can only handle so much before it begins to shut down, disconnecting from the outside world as a way of protecting itself from further harm. She recommended a slow, careful approach to treatment, one that did not force Rachel to confront her trauma too quickly. The goal, she said, was to create a sense of safety, to allow Rachel's mind to gradually understand that she was no longer in danger. But even with the best care, Dr. Fletcher warned that recovery could take months or even years, and there was no guarantee that Rachel would ever fully return to the person she had been before. As the days passed, the media began to pick up the story. News outlets across Arizona reported that Rachel Winters, the hiker who had disappeared 3 years earlier, had been found alive in the Tonto National Forest. The details were sparse at first, but as more information leaked from hospital staff and law enforcement, the story took on a life of its own. Reporters camped outside the hospital, hoping for a statement from the family or the doctors. Online forums and social media platforms exploded with speculation. Some people called it a miracle. Others questioned how it was possible. Theories ranged from the plausible to the absurd. Some suggested Rachel had been held captive by someone living off the grid in the forest. Others believed she had suffered a mental breakdown and had been living in a fugue state, unaware of who she was or where she came from. A few even proposed that she had chosen to disappear, that she had wanted to escape her life and had somehow managed to survive on her own for 3 years. But none of these theories could explain the evidence. There were no signs of another person at the site where she was found. There were no footprints, no tools, no remnants of anything that would suggest someone else had been there. And if Rachel had been living in a fugue state, how had she managed to build fires, find food, and stay alive in such a harsh environment? Detective Larson knew that the only person who could answer these questions was Rachel herself. But until she was able to speak, the truth would remain locked inside her mind, hidden behind the walls her trauma had built. Weeks turned into months, and Rachel remained in the hospital under constant observation. Her physical recovery progressed at a steady pace. The doctors managed to restore her weight gradually, feeding her through a carefully monitored nutrition plan that her weakened digestive system could handle. Her muscle mass began to return, though she remained frail and required assistance to sit up or move around the room. The fractures in her bones were healing, and the wounds on her feet and hands had closed, leaving behind thick scars that would never fully fade. But her mind remained distant, locked away in a place no one could reach. Dr. Fletcher continued her sessions with Rachel, sitting beside her bed and speaking in a calm, measured tone. She did not ask questions or expect answers. Instead, she simply talked, describing the room, the weather outside, the sounds of the hospital, anything that might help Rachel orient herself to the present. Sometimes she would read aloud from books or play soft music, hoping that something might trigger a response. Occasionally, Rachel's eyes would move toward the sound of Dr. Fletcher's voice, and once or twice her lips seemed to twitch as if she were trying to form words. But nothing came. Her father continued his daily visits, often bringing small items from home, a photograph of Rachel as a child, a bracelet she used to wear, a stuffed animal she had kept from her teenage years. He would place these objects on the table beside her bed, hoping they might stir some memory, some connection to the life she had lived before the forest. One afternoon in late August, nearly 3 months after Rachel had been found, something changed. A nurse named Patricia Lowe was in the room, adjusting the 4-line and checking Rachel's vital signs, when she noticed Rachel's hand move. It was subtle, just a slight curl of the fingers, but it was deliberate. Patricia stopped what she was doing and watched. Rachel's hand moved again, this time reaching toward the edge of the blanket. Her fingers gripped the fabric weakly, then released it. Patricia spoke softly, asking Rachel if she could hear her. There was no verbal response, but Rachel's eyes shifted, focusing on Patricia's face for the first time since she had been admitted. It was a brief moment, lasting only a few seconds, but it was real. Patricia immediately called for Dr. Fletcher, who arrived within minutes. She approached Rachel carefully, speaking in the same gentle tone she always used. She asked Rachel if she knew where she was. No answer. She asked if Rachel could hear her. Still no answer. But when Dr. Fletcher reached out and gently touched Rachel's hand, Rachel's fingers closed around hers, holding on for just a moment before letting go. It was progress, small but undeniable. Over the following weeks, these moments became more frequent. Rachel began to respond to touch more consistently. She would turn her head when someone entered the room. She would blink when a light was shined in her eyes. Her breathing would change slightly when her father spoke to her, as if some part of her recognized his voice. Then, in early September, Rachel spoke her first word. It happened without warning. Dr. Fletcher was sitting beside her, reading aloud from a book about the forests of Arizona, describing the tall pines and the way sunlight filters through the branches. Rachel's lips moved, forming a sound so quiet that Dr. Fletcher almost missed it. She stopped reading and leaned closer. Rachel's mouth opened slightly, and the word came again, barely a whisper. Cold. Dr. Fletcher felt a chill run down her spine. She asked Rachel to repeat it, and after a long pause, Rachel did. Cold. It was the first coherent word she had spoken in 3 months, and it carried a weight that no one in the room could ignore. Dr. Fletcher wrote it down immediately, noting the time and context. She asked Rachel if she was cold now, if she needed another blanket. Rachel did not answer. Her eyes drifted back to the ceiling and she fell silent again. But the word had been spoken, and it opened a door that had been sealed shut for years. In the days that followed, Rachel began to speak more, though her words came in fragments, scattered and disconnected. She would say single words or short phrases, often repeating them several times as if testing their meaning. Dark, trees, water, alone. Each word was delivered in the same flat, emotionless tone, as if she were reciting a list rather than communicating thoughts or feelings. Dr. Fletcher recorded every word, looking for patterns, trying to piece together what Rachel was trying to say. She noticed that many of the words related to the environment, to nature, to sensations of cold, hunger, and fear. There were no references to people, no names, no mentions of family or friends. It was as if Rachel's entire world had been reduced to the raw elements of survival. Detective Larson was informed of Rachel's progress and requested permission to speak with her. Dr. Fletcher was hesitant, warning him that Rachel was still in a fragile state and that pushing her too hard could cause her to retreat further into herself. But Larson argued that time was critical. If Rachel had been the victim of a crime, if someone had held her in the forest or harmed her in any way, they needed to know as soon as possible so they could investigate. Dr. Fletcher agreed to allow a brief, supervised conversation, but only under strict conditions. Larson could ask questions, but he had to keep them simple and non-threatening. If Rachel showed any signs of distress, the session would end immediately. On a quiet afternoon in mid-September, Detective Larson sat down beside Rachel's bed. She was sitting up for the first time, propped against pillows, her thin frame barely filling the hospital gown. Her eyes were open, staring at the window where sunlight streamed in through half-closed blinds. Larson introduced himself, speaking slowly and clearly. He told Rachel that he was there to help her, that he wanted to understand what had happened to her in the forest. He asked if she remembered going on a hike 3 years ago. Rachel did not respond. He asked if she remembered getting lost. Still nothing. He asked if anyone had hurt her, if someone had taken her into the forest against her will. At that question, Rachel's expression changed. Her jaw tightened, and her hands gripped the blanket. Her breathing quickened, and for a moment it seemed like she might speak. But instead, she turned her head away, closing her eyes. Dr. Fletcher, who had been observing from the corner of the room, stepped forward and signaled to Larson that the session was over. He nodded and stood, but before he left, he placed a card on the table beside Rachel's bed. He told her that if she ever wanted to talk, if she ever felt ready to tell her story, she could reach him anytime. Rachel did not acknowledge him. That night, one of the nurses found Rachel sitting up in bed, staring at the card Larson had left behind. She had picked it up and was holding it in her hands, her fingers tracing the edges. The nurse asked if she was okay, and Rachel looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. Then, for the first time, Rachel asked a question. How long? The nurse did not understand at first and asked Rachel to clarify. Rachel repeated the question, her voice stronger this time. How long was I gone? The nurse hesitated, unsure how to answer. She told Rachel that she had been missing for 3 years. Rachel's face did not change. She simply nodded as if confirming something she already knew and lay back down. The next morning, Dr. Fletcher arrived to find Rachel sitting in a chair by the window, the first time she had moved from the bed on her own. Her father was there, sitting across from her, tears streaming down his face. Rachel was looking at him, really looking at him, and though she had not said anything, Paul felt that his daughter had finally come back, at least partly. Dr. Fletcher approached carefully and asked Rachel how she was feeling. Rachel turned to her and spoke in a low, steady voice. I want to remember. Dr. Fletcher sat down beside her and asked what she meant. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. She said that there were pieces missing, gaps in her memory that she could not fill. She remembered being in the forest. She remembered the trees, the cold nights, the hunger. But she could not remember how she got there, or why she had stayed, or what had kept her from leaving. If you're finding this story as unsettling as we are, please consider subscribing to stay updated on cases like Rachel's that challenge everything we think we know about survival and the human mind. Over the following sessions, Dr. Fletcher used a technique called guided recall, a method designed to help trauma survivors access buried memories without overwhelming them. She would ask Rachel to focus on specific sensory details, the smell of the pine trees, the sound of the wind, the feeling of the ground beneath her feet, and slowly build outward from there. Rachel's memories came back in pieces, disjointed and incomplete, but each session revealed a little more. She remembered walking on the trail, feeling confident and at ease. She remembered stopping to take a photograph of the view, the forest stretching out below her, endless and green. She remembered hearing something, a sound that did not belong, a rustling in the bushes that made her pause. Then there was a gap, a blank space where her memory simply stopped. The next thing she remembered was waking up in darkness, lying on the ground, her head pounding and her vision blurred. She did not know where she was or how she had gotten there. She tried to stand but her legs would not support her. She called out but no one answered. She remembered the fear, the deep, cold fear that settled in her chest and never fully went away. She remembered crawling, using her hands to feel her way through the dark, touching trees and rocks and trying to find something familiar. But everything looked the same. She remembered finding water, a small stream that trickled between the rocks, and drinking from it until her stomach ached. She remembered being so hungry that she ate leaves and bark, chewing them even though they tasted bitter and made her sick. She remembered the nights, long and freezing, huddled against a tree, shivering so violently that she thought her bones might break. And she remembered the fear of being found, though she could not explain why. Dr. Fletcher pressed gently, asking Rachel what she meant by that. Rachel looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. She said that at some point she stopped wanting to be rescued. She could not explain why, but the idea of returning to the world, to people, to noise and light and expectations, felt unbearable. The forest, for all its cruelty, had become the only place that made sense. There was no past, no future, only the present moment, the endless cycle of surviving one more day. Dr. Fletcher asked if Rachel had ever tried to leave, if she had ever walked toward a trail or a road. Rachel nodded slowly. She said she had tried many times in the beginning, but every time she thought she was getting close, something would stop her. Sometimes it was exhaustion. Sometimes it was fear. And sometimes, she said, it felt like the forest itself was holding her back, like the trees moved when she was not looking, like the paths shifted and led her in circles. She knew it did not make sense, but that was how it felt. Detective Larson reviewed Dr. Fletcher's notes carefully, trying to separate fact from trauma-induced perception. He knew that the mind could play tricks on people under extreme stress, that isolation could warp a person's sense of reality. But he also knew that Rachel's story, however fragmented, was the only account they had. He returned to the forest with a larger team, determined to find answers. The second investigation into the site where Rachel had been found was far more thorough than the first. Detective Larson assembled a team that included forensic specialists, a botanist familiar with the regional flora, a geologist who understood the terrain, and 2 experienced trackers who had worked on missing persons cases throughout the Southwest. They arrived at the location in early October, nearly 4 months after Rachel had been discovered, and set up a base camp a short distance from the tree where she had been sitting. The goal was to map every detail of the area, to reconstruct Rachel's movements as best they could, and to determine whether there was any evidence of another person having been present during her years in the forest. The team worked methodically, dividing the area into sections and photographing everything before disturbing the ground. They used metal detectors to search for any objects that might have been buried or hidden beneath layers of dirt and pine needles. They collected soil samples, examined the bark of surrounding trees, and carefully documented the position of every stone and branch. What they found over the next several days painted a picture that was both clearer and more troubling than anyone had anticipated. The fire pit that had been noted during the initial search was examined more closely. The stones that formed the circle were not native to the immediate area. A geologist confirmed that they had been carried from a location at least half a mile away, which meant someone had intentionally gathered them and arranged them. The ash inside the pit was tested and found to contain traces of organic material, not just wood but also bones, seeds, and what appeared to be remnants of cloth. The forensic team estimated that the fire had been used repeatedly over a period of at least 2 years, possibly longer. Nearby, the team discovered a series of markings carved into the trunks of several trees. These were not the counting marks found on the tree where Rachel had been resting. These were different, deeper, more deliberate. Some of them resembled crude symbols, circles with lines radiating outward, triangles stacked on top of one another, shapes that did not correspond to any known language or code. One of the trackers, a man named Vincent Palmer, suggested that they might be territorial markers, the kind of signs people leave to indicate ownership or boundaries. But if that was the case, it raised an uncomfortable question. Who had made them? The botanist on the team, a woman named Dr. Helen Kraft, examined the vegetation around the site and made a curious observation. In a small clearing about 30 feet from the main camp area, she found evidence of deliberate cultivation. Several wild plants, including a type of edible tuber and a leafy green that grew in shaded areas, had been carefully tended. The soil around them had been loosened and cleared of competing weeds. Dr. Kraft explained that this kind of management required knowledge and consistency. It was not something that would happen naturally, and it was not something a person in a state of panic or confusion would think to do. It suggested planning, patience, and an understanding of the environment that went beyond basic survival instinct. Detective Larson asked Dr. Kraft if Rachel could have done this herself. Dr. Kraft hesitated before answering. She said it was possible but unlikely. The level of care required to maintain these plants over multiple growing seasons suggested someone with either prior experience in wilderness agriculture or someone who had been living in the forest long enough to learn through trial and error. Given Rachel's background as a graphic designer with no formal training in botany or survival skills, it seemed improbable that she could have managed it alone, especially in the early stages of her disappearance when she would have been disoriented and physically weakened. The team also found a shelter, though calling it that might have been generous. It was little more than a lean-to constructed from fallen branches, bark, and dried brush, tucked into a natural depression between two large boulders. The structure was partially collapsed, but enough remained to show that it had been built with some degree of skill. The interior was just large enough for one person to lie down, and the ground inside was covered with a thick layer of moss and pine needles, creating a makeshift bed. Forensic analysts found strands of hair inside the shelter that matched Rachel's DNA, confirming that she had used it at some point. But they also found something else. Mixed in with Rachel's hair were several strands that did not match. The DNA analysis would take weeks to complete, but the initial visual examination suggested that the hair belonged to someone else. Someone who had been in close proximity to Rachel during her time in the forest. Detective Larson felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he read the preliminary report. If someone else had been there, if Rachel had not been alone, then everything about the case changed. It was no longer just a story of survival against the odds. It became a potential criminal investigation, one that involved abduction, imprisonment, and possibly worse. He ordered the team to expand the search radius, looking for any other signs of human activity. They found more than he expected. About a quarter-mile to the east, hidden beneath a thick canopy of trees, the team discovered what appeared to be a second campsite. This one was more established, more permanent. There was a larger fire pit, this one surrounded by flat stones that had been carefully placed to create a cooking surface. Nearby were the remains of a crude smokehouse, a wooden frame draped with animal hides that had long since rotted away. Inside they found bones, lots of them stacked neatly in piles. Most were from small game, rabbits, squirrels, birds, but there were also larger bones, possibly from deer or wild boar. The bones had been cleaned and some had been split open to extract the marrow, a practice common among people living off the land for extended periods. But the most disturbing discovery came when one of the forensic technicians lifted a flat stone near the fire pit and found a small cache of items buried beneath it. There were several pieces of clothing, faded and torn, that did not belong to Rachel. There was a hunting knife with a bone handle, its blade worn but still sharp. There was a coil of thin rope, frayed at the ends. And there was a small notebook, its pages swollen with moisture and covered in handwriting that was barely legible. The notebook was carefully extracted and placed in a protective case to prevent further deterioration. Back at the lab, specialists worked to separate the pages and photograph each one under controlled lighting. What they found inside was a journal, written over the course of many months, possibly years. The handwriting was erratic, sometimes neat and controlled, other times wild and difficult to read. The entries were not dated in any conventional sense. Instead, they were marked by references to seasons, weather patterns, and natural events. One entry read, "Winter is here again. The cold makes her weak. I bring her meat but she will not eat. She cries at night. I do not understand why she cries. This place is safe. There is no danger here. I have made it so." Another entry written in a different tone said, "She tried to leave again today. I found her near the ridge, stumbling, calling out for help. I brought her back. She does not understand. Out there is chaos. Out here is order. I am teaching her, but she is slow to learn." The entries went on, page after page, chronicling a relationship that was deeply disturbing. The writer referred to Rachel as she, or the girl, and spoke of her as if she were a project, something to be managed and controlled. There were references to bringing her food, to watching her from a distance, to preventing her from leaving the forest. There were also moments of tenderness, strange and unsettling, where the writer described sitting near her while she slept, or speaking to her even though she did not respond. One passage stood out to Detective Larson. It read, "She has stopped fighting. That is good. Fighting only brings pain. Now she sits quietly and watches the trees. I think she is beginning to understand. The world outside is a lie. Here in the silence we are real." The handwriting in that entry was unusually calm, almost peaceful, as if the writer had reached some kind of resolution. Larson handed the notebook over to a forensic psychologist who specialized in criminal behavior. The psychologist, a man named Dr. Raymond Collier, spent several days analyzing the entries. His assessment was chilling. He concluded that the writer exhibited signs of severe delusional disorder, combined with obsessive tendencies and a distorted sense of reality. The person who wrote the journal believed that they were protecting Rachel, that they were saving her from something, even as they were holding her captive. Dr. Collier noted that this kind of mindset was often seen in cases of isolated individuals who had withdrawn from society and constructed their own moral framework, one that justified their actions no matter how harmful they were to others. He also pointed out that the writer's language suggested a long period of solitude before encountering Rachel, which meant this person had likely been living in the forest for years, possibly decades, before she disappeared. Detective Larson now faced a critical question. Who was this person and where were they now? He ran the DNA from the hair found in the shelter through every database available, including national criminal records, missing persons files, and military personnel archives. There were no matches. Whoever had been living in the forest with Rachel had no official identity, at least not one that was recorded in any system. Larson reached out to local authorities and park services, asking if anyone had reported sightings of a hermit or recluse in the Tonto National Forest over the past decade. Several people came forward with stories. A hunter claimed he had once seen a man living in a cave near the southern edge of the forest, but when he returned with others to investigate, the cave was empty. A retired ranger said that in the early 2000s, there were rumors of someone living off the grid in the deeper parts of the forest, someone who avoided contact and left no trace. But none of these accounts could be confirmed, and none provided enough detail to identify the individual. The investigation hit a wall. Without a name, without a face, without any concrete evidence of who this person was, there was little Larson could do. He had a journal, some DNA, and a series of campsites, but no suspect. He knew that the person who had held Rachel could still be out there, somewhere in the vast expanse of the Tonto National Forest, living as they had always lived, hidden and unreachable. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Rachel's recovery continued. She was now able to walk short distances with assistance, and her speech had improved significantly. She could hold conversations, though they were often brief, and she still struggled with certain memories. Dr. Fletcher continued to work with her, helping her process the trauma and rebuild her sense of self. One afternoon, Dr. Fletcher showed Rachel a photograph of the journal that had been found at the second campsite. She asked Rachel if the handwriting looked familiar, if she remembered anyone writing in a notebook while she was in the forest. Rachel stared at the image for a long time, her expression unreadable. Finally she nodded. She said she remembered seeing someone writing, though the memory was hazy, like something viewed through fog. She said the person would sit by the fire at night, bent over a small book, moving a pen slowly across the pages. She said she never saw their face clearly, that they always kept to the shadows, but she remembered the sound of the pen scratching against paper, a sound that became as familiar to her as the wind in the trees. Dr. Fletcher asked Rachel if this person had ever spoken to her. Rachel closed her eyes, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. She said yes, they had spoken, but not in the way normal people spoke. The words were strange, she said, like they came from somewhere far away. They talked about the forest, about how it was the only place that mattered, about how the outside world was broken and false. Make sure you're following along because the next part of Rachel's story reveals details that investigators are still trying to fully understand. Rachel said she tried to argue at first, tried to tell them that she wanted to go home, that people were looking for her. But the person would not listen. They would just shake their head and walk away, leaving her alone in the dark. Over time, Rachel said she stopped arguing. She stopped trying to explain. She simply existed day after day, in a world that had shrunk to the size of a few trees and a patch of dirt. As Rachel's physical strength returned and her ability to communicate improved, Dr. Fletcher began to explore the deeper psychological impact of her 3 years in isolation. The sessions grew longer and more detailed, and Rachel, though still fragile, showed a growing willingness to confront the memories she had buried. She spoke about the passage of time, or rather, the loss of it. She described how days blurred into one another until the concept of a day no longer had meaning. There was light and there was dark, and in between there was only the struggle to stay alive. She said that at some point she stopped counting the marks on the tree because the numbers felt meaningless. What difference did it make if it had been 100 days or 1,000? She was still there, still trapped, and the count only reminded her of how long she had been gone. Dr. Fletcher asked Rachel about the person who had kept her in the forest, the one who had written the journal. She wanted to know more about their interactions, about what had been said and done during those long months and years. Rachel's answers came slowly, each one pulled from a place of deep reluctance. She said the person had never told her their name. She had tried asking once early on, but they had simply looked at her without answering, as if the question itself was absurd. After that, she stopped asking. She stopped expecting normal responses. The person existed in her world like a force of nature, unpredictable and beyond reason. Rachel described how the person would appear without warning, emerging from the trees so quietly that she would not know they were there until they spoke or moved. Sometimes they brought food, a rabbit they had trapped, roots they had dug up, water collected in a hollowed piece of bark. Other times they brought nothing, just sat nearby and watched her. Rachel said the watching was the worst part. She could feel their eyes on her even when she could not see them, and it made her skin crawl. She said she never felt safe, not even when they were gone, because she never knew when they would return. Dr. Fletcher asked if the person had ever harmed her physically. Rachel hesitated, her hands twisting together in her lap. She said there had been moments when she thought they might, moments when their mood shifted and the air felt heavy with something dangerous. But they never struck her, never touched her in a violent way. The harm, she said, was quieter. It was in the control, in the isolation, in the way they made her depend on them for everything while also making her feel like she was nothing. There was one incident Rachel remembered more clearly than most. It had happened during what she believed was her second year in the forest, though she could not be certain of the timeline. She had found a trail, a narrow path that looked like it might lead somewhere, and she had followed it, moving as quickly as her weakened body would allow. For the first time in months she felt hope. She thought that maybe, finally, she was going to find a way out. But after what felt like hours of walking, the trail looped back on itself, and she found herself standing in the exact spot where she had started. She said she collapsed there, sobbing, and that was when the person appeared. They stood over her, silent, and then they spoke. Rachel could not remember the exact words, but the meaning was clear. There was no way out. The forest was a circle, and she was at its center. They told her that she needed to stop running, stop hoping for rescue, and accept where she was. Rachel said that was the moment something inside her broke. She stopped believing she would ever leave. Dr. Fletcher took extensive notes during these sessions, knowing that Rachel's testimony was not only crucial for her own healing but also for the ongoing investigation. Detective Larson had requested regular updates, and Dr. Fletcher provided them, though she was careful to protect Rachel's privacy and emotional well-being. Larson, for his part, was frustrated by the lack of progress in identifying the individual who had held Rachel. Despite the journal, the DNA evidence, and the detailed descriptions Rachel was now providing, there was still no name, no face, and no clear trail to follow. He decided to take a different approach. He began reaching out to experts in cases involving long-term isolation and captivity, hoping to find patterns or similarities that might shed light on Rachel's situation. One of the people he contacted was a criminal psychologist named Dr. Alan Mercer, who had worked on several high-profile abduction cases over the past 2 decades. Dr. Mercer reviewed the case file, read excerpts from the journal, and listened to recordings of Rachel's sessions with Dr. Fletcher. His analysis was both insightful and deeply unsettling. Dr. Mercer explained that the person who had held Rachel exhibited characteristics of what he called a delusional caretaker, someone who believed they were acting in the best interest of their victim, even as they inflicted profound harm. This type of individual, he said, often had a distorted view of the world, seeing it as hostile or corrupt, and believed that by isolating someone they were protecting them. The relationship, twisted as it was, became a form of codependency, with the captor deriving purpose and meaning from their role as protector, and the victim, over time, losing the will or ability to resist. Dr. Mercer also noted that the journal entries suggested the person had been living in isolation long before encountering Rachel. The language used, the references to the forest as a place of order and safety, indicated someone who had completely withdrawn from society and reconstructed their identity around their environment. He speculated that this individual may have experienced some kind of trauma or breakdown years earlier, something that drove them into the wilderness and kept them there. What made Rachel's case particularly unusual, Dr. Mercer said, was the length of time she had survived. Most victims in similar situations either escaped within the first few months or did not survive at all. The fact that Rachel had endured for 3 years suggested that her captor had, in their own disturbed way, kept her alive, providing just enough food and water to prevent her from dying, while simultaneously ensuring she remained too weak and disoriented to escape. It was a delicate and disturbing balance, one that required both knowledge of the environment and a willingness to exert control over another human being for an extended period. Detective Larson asked Dr. Mercer if he thought the person was still in the forest. Dr. Mercer said it was likely. People who live off the grid for that long rarely reintegrate into society. The forest had become their entire world, and leaving it would feel like a kind of death. He suggested that the individual might still be out there, moving through the same areas, following the same routines, and possibly searching for Rachel, unaware that she had been found. The thought sent a chill through Larson. He immediately contacted the Tonto National Forest Rangers and requested increased patrols in the area where Rachel had been discovered. He also arranged for trail cameras to be installed at key points throughout the forest, hoping to capture images of anyone moving through the area. Weeks passed with no results. The cameras recorded deer, elk, coyotes, and the occasional hiker, but no sign of the person they were looking for. Larson began to wonder if the individual had somehow sensed the heightened activity and gone deeper into the wilderness, beyond the reach of patrols and surveillance. Or perhaps, he thought grimly, they had already left the area entirely, vanishing into another remote corner of the state where they could continue living as they always had, invisible and untouchable. Back at the hospital, Rachel's progress continued, though it was not without setbacks. There were days when she seemed strong, when she could speak clearly and engage with her family and doctors. But there were also days when she withdrew, when the trauma resurfaced and she became silent and distant, her eyes filled with a fear that no amount of reassurance could erase. Her father, Paul, struggled to understand what his daughter had been through. He spent hours talking with Dr. Fletcher, trying to grasp the psychological toll of prolonged captivity and isolation. Dr. Fletcher explained that Rachel's mind had adapted to an environment of constant stress and uncertainty, and that returning to normal life was not a simple matter of leaving the forest behind. The effects of trauma, she said, would stay with Rachel for years, possibly for the rest of her life. There would be triggers, moments when a sound or a smell or a shadow would transport her back to that place, and she would have to learn how to manage those moments without being consumed by them. Paul asked if Rachel would ever be able to live independently again, to work, to have relationships, to experience joy. Dr. Fletcher did not want to give false hope, but she also did not want to take it away. She said that recovery was possible, but it would take time, patience, and a strong support system. Rachel had survived something that most people could not even imagine, and that resilience, Dr. Fletcher believed, would serve her well in the long road ahead. In late November, nearly 6 months after Rachel had been found, she was deemed stable enough to be discharged from the hospital. She moved into her parents' home in Flagstaff, where a room had been prepared for her, quiet and filled with soft light. The transition was difficult. Rachel found the walls of the house confining, the presence of other people overwhelming. She would often wake in the middle of the night, disoriented and afraid, unsure of where she was. Her mother would find her sitting by the window, staring out at the dark trees beyond the yard, her expression unreadable. Dr. Fletcher continued to see Rachel twice a week, conducting sessions at the house rather than requiring Rachel to travel. They worked on grounding techniques, ways for Rachel to anchor herself in the present when the past became too vivid. They also worked on rebuilding Rachel's sense of agency, helping her make small decisions about her daily life, what to eat, what to wear, where to sit. These choices, simple as they were, represented a reclaiming of control that had been taken from her in the forest. Detective Larson visited Rachel once during this time, with Dr. Fletcher's permission and under careful supervision. He did not press her for details or ask about the investigation. Instead, he simply told her that he was still looking, still trying to find the person who had done this to her. Rachel looked at him with tired eyes and said something that stayed with him long after he left. She said that part of her did not want them to be found. Larson asked why, and Rachel explained that if the person was caught, if they were brought into the light and questioned and judged, then the story would become real in a way it was not yet. Right now, she said, it felt like something that happened in a dream, something distant and unreal. But if there was a trial, if there were cameras and reporters and people asking her to relive every moment, then it would become concrete, permanent, and she did not know if she could survive that. Larson understood. He told her that whatever she needed, whatever she decided, he would respect it. But he also told her that the person who had done this needed to be stopped, not just for her sake, but for the sake of anyone else who might wander into that forest and find themselves face to face with someone who saw them not as a person, but as a possession. Rachel did not respond, but Larson could see the conflict in her eyes, the war between wanting justice and wanting peace. As winter settled over Flagstaff, Rachel began to take short walks with her father, staying close to the house at first, then gradually venturing farther. The cold air and the smell of pine reminded her of the forest, but in a different way now, less oppressive, less suffocating. Her father would walk beside her in silence, giving her space to think, to breathe, to simply exist without expectation. One afternoon, as they walked along a quiet trail near their home, Rachel stopped and looked out at the trees. She said that she used to love the forest, that it had been a place of peace and beauty for her. Now, she said, it felt like a scar, a mark that would never fully heal. But she also said that she did not want to be afraid of it forever. She wanted to find a way to reclaim it, to walk among the trees again without feeling like they were closing in on her. Paul told her that she would, in time, and that he would be there with her every step of the way. The months that followed were a slow and uneven journey toward something that resembled normalcy, though Rachel knew she would never truly return to the person she had been before the forest. By the spring of 2019, nearly a year after her rescue, she had regained most of her physical strength. Her weight had stabilized, her hair had grown back, and the scars on her hands and feet had faded to pale lines that she could almost ignore. But the internal scars remained, etched deep into her mind, surfacing in moments of silence or solitude when the memories would slip through the barriers she had worked so hard to build. Dr. Fletcher continued to work with Rachel, though the sessions had shifted from crisis intervention to long-term management. They focused on helping Rachel develop coping strategies for the triggers that still plagued her, the sound of wind moving through branches, the smell of damp earth, the feeling of being watched. Rachel had learned to recognize these moments and to ground herself using techniques Dr. Fletcher had taught her: breathing exercises, sensory awareness, and cognitive reframing. But there were still days when the techniques were not enough, when the weight of what she had endured pressed down on her so heavily that she could barely move. On those days, her mother would sit with her, not speaking, just present, a quiet reminder that she was no longer alone. Rachel had also begun to reconnect with her past in small, careful steps. She reached out to Jennifer, her former roommate, who had never stopped looking for her during the 3 years she was missing. Their first conversation was awkward and emotional, filled with long pauses and tears, but it was also healing. Jennifer told Rachel that she had never given up hope, that even when the authorities stopped searching, she had continued to believe that Rachel was out there somewhere. Rachel thanked her, though she struggled to put into words what that faith had meant, even if she had not known about it at the time. She also reconnected with a few old friends, though those relationships were harder to navigate. People did not know what to say to her, how to act around someone who had survived something so incomprehensible. Some tried too hard to be cheerful, filling the silence with nervous chatter. Others were overly cautious, treating her like she was fragile and might shatter at any moment. Rachel appreciated the effort, but she also felt the distance that had grown between her and the life she had once known. She was not the same person anymore, and pretending otherwise only made the gap feel wider. Detective Larson remained in contact with Rachel throughout this period, though his updates were infrequent and often disappointing. Despite the trail cameras, the increased patrols, and the continued analysis of evidence from the forest, the person who had held Rachel captive had not been found. The DNA recovered from the shelter had been run through every available database with no matches. The journal had been analyzed by handwriting experts, linguists, and psychologists, but it offered no definitive clues to the writer's identity. The individual remained a ghost, a shadow that had slipped through the cracks of society so completely that it was as if they had never existed at all. Larson had not given up, but he was realistic about the challenges. The Tonto National Forest covered nearly 3 million acres of rugged, remote terrain. If someone wanted to disappear into that landscape, if they knew how to live off the land and avoid detection, they could remain hidden indefinitely. He told Rachel that the case would remain open, that he would continue to follow any leads that emerged, but he also prepared her for the possibility that they might never find answers. Rachel had made peace with that, or at least she told herself she had. Part of her wanted closure, wanted to see the person who had taken 3 years of her life held accountable. But another part of her, the part that had learned to survive in the silence and the dark, understood that some questions would never be answered, and that she had to find a way to live with that uncertainty. In the summer of 2019, Rachel made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She told her parents and Dr. Fletcher that she wanted to return to the forest, not to the place where she had been held, but to the Highline Trail where her journey had begun. She said she needed to face it, to walk that path again and prove to herself that the forest did not own her anymore. Dr. Fletcher was cautious, warning Rachel that revisiting the site of trauma could be destabilizing, but she also recognized the symbolic importance of what Rachel was proposing. After several discussions, they agreed that Rachel could make the trip, but only with proper support. Her father would accompany her, along with Dr. Fletcher and a park ranger who knew the area well. They would go slowly, and if at any point Rachel felt overwhelmed, they would turn back. On a clear morning in late July, Rachel stood at the trailhead of the Highline Trail for the first time in 4 years. The parking lot looked exactly as she remembered it, the same information boards, the same wooden benches, the same view of the forest stretching out into the distance. Her heart was pounding and her hands were trembling, but she took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her father walked beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. Dr. Fletcher stayed a few steps behind, watching Rachel carefully for any signs of distress. The ranger, a young woman named Sophie Ruiz, led the way, pointing out landmarks and explaining the trail conditions. They moved slowly, taking frequent breaks, and Rachel focused on the physical sensations of walking, the crunch of gravel under her boots, the warmth of the sun on her face, the rhythm of her breathing. For the first mile, Rachel felt disconnected, as if she were watching herself from a distance. But as they climbed higher and the forest closed in around them, something shifted. The fear that she had expected, the panic that she had prepared for, did not come. Instead, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, not the suffocating familiarity of captivity, but something older, something that reached back to the person she had been before everything had happened. She remembered why she had loved this place, why she had come here to find peace and clarity. The forest was still beautiful. The trees still reached toward the sky. The air still smelled of pine and earth. And for the first time in years, Rachel felt a flicker of something she had almost forgotten. Hope. They reached a clearing about 2 miles in and Rachel asked to stop. She sat on a flat rock and looked out at the valley below, the same view she had photographed on the day she disappeared. Her father sat beside her, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Finally, Rachel said that she had spent so much time being afraid of this place, of what it represented, that she had forgotten it was also a place of beauty. She said that the person who had taken her had tried to turn the forest into a prison, but they had not succeeded. The forest was not evil. It was not her enemy. It was just a forest, indifferent and vast, and she had as much right to be here as anyone. Paul reached over and took her hand, and they sat together in the sunlight, listening to the wind move through the trees. When they finally stood to head back, Rachel turned and looked one last time at the trail that led deeper into the forest, the trail that she had followed 4 years ago and that had led to so much pain. She knew she would never walk that path again, but she also knew that she did not need to. She had faced the forest and she had walked away on her own terms. That was enough. If this story has moved you or made you think differently about survival and resilience, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who might need to hear Rachel's story. In the months that followed, Rachel began to rebuild her life in earnest. She enrolled in a part-time online program to refresh her skills in graphic design, working at her own pace and from the safety of her home. It was difficult at first. Her concentration was not what it used to be, and there were days when she could not focus on anything for more than a few minutes. But she persisted, and slowly the work became easier. She found comfort in the structure, in having goals and deadlines, in creating something with her hands that existed outside of her trauma. She also began volunteering with a nonprofit organization that supported survivors of abduction and long-term captivity. Her role was limited at first, just answering emails and offering words of encouragement to others who were navigating their own recoveries. But over time she became more involved, sharing her story in carefully moderated settings and helping to raise awareness about the psychological impact of prolonged isolation. It was painful to revisit her experiences, but it was also empowering. She was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor and her voice mattered. Detective Larson continued his work on the case, though the active investigation had slowed considerably. He kept the trail cameras in place and maintained contact with rangers and locals in the Payson area, asking them to report any unusual activity or sightings of individuals living off the grid. In the fall of 2019, one of the cameras captured an image that made his pulse quicken. It showed a figure moving through the trees at dusk, partially obscured by shadows. The person was tall, lean, and appeared to be carrying a pack. The image was grainy and the face was not visible, but the posture and the way the person moved, silent and deliberate, matched the profile of someone who had spent years living in the wilderness. Larson immediately organized a search team and returned to the area where the camera had been placed. They combed the surrounding forest for 3 days, looking for tracks, campsites, or any other evidence that the person in the photograph was the same individual who had held Rachel. They found nothing conclusive. There were old fire pits and scattered bones, but no way to determine how recent they were or who had left them. The figure in the photograph remained unidentified, and after a week of fruitless searching, the operation was called off. Larson sent the image to Rachel, asking if it triggered any recognition. She studied it for a long time, her hands shaking slightly as she held the printout. She said that she could not be sure that the person in the photograph could be anyone, but there was something about the way they stood, the way they seemed to blend into the trees that felt familiar. She told Larson that if it was the same person, she hoped they stayed in the forest, far away from anyone else who might wander into their path. Larson asked her if she wanted him to continue searching, if she wanted him to keep pursuing the case even if it meant years of effort with no guarantee of success. Rachel thought about it for a long time before answering. She said that she did, not because she needed revenge or closure, but because she believed that the person out there was dangerous, and that if they encountered someone else, someone less fortunate or less resilient, the outcome might be far worse. She said that her survival had been a combination of luck, stubbornness, and circumstances that could not be replicated, and she did not want someone else to go through what she had gone through. Larson promised her that he would not stop looking. As 2020 arrived, Rachel marked the 5th anniversary of her disappearance in a way that felt meaningful to her. She organized a small gathering at her parents' home, inviting the people who had supported her through her recovery, Dr. Fletcher, Jennifer, a few close friends, and Detective Larson. It was not a celebration, but it was not a mourning either. It was an acknowledgement of everything she had endured and everything she had overcome. During the gathering, Rachel spoke briefly, thanking everyone for their patience, their kindness, and their refusal to give up on her. She said that she had spent a long time feeling like the forest had stolen something from her, something essential that she would never get back. But she had come to realize that while the forest had taken much, it had not taken everything. She was still here, still breathing, still fighting, and that meant she had won. Paul stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, tears streaming down his face. He told the group that watching his daughter reclaim her life had been the greatest privilege of his existence, and that he was proud beyond words of the strength she had shown. Dr. Fletcher added that Rachel's journey was far from over, but that she had already accomplished something extraordinary. She had taken the worst experience imaginable and refused to let it define her. She had chosen to live, not just survive, and that choice, made every single day, was an act of courage that deserved to be recognized. Detective Larson, who had stayed quiet for most of the gathering, finally spoke. He said that in his many years of law enforcement he had seen countless victims of terrible crimes, but he had rarely seen someone fight as hard as Rachel had to reclaim their life. He said that the case was still open, that he was still searching, and that he would not rest until he had answers. But he also said that regardless of what happened with the investigation, Rachel had already achieved something more important than justice. She had survived, and she had found a way to keep moving forward. The gathering ended quietly, and as people began to leave, Rachel stood by the window, looking out at the night sky. Her mother joined her, and they stood together in silence for a while. Finally, Rachel said that she had been thinking about the person in the forest, about whether they were still out there, still alone, still convinced that the world outside was broken and that isolation was the only answer. Her mother asked what she thought, and Rachel said that she hoped, in some strange way, that they had found peace, whatever that meant for them. She said that she did not forgive them, and she did not excuse what they had done, but she also did not want to carry hatred for the rest of her life. It was too heavy, and she had already carried enough. In the years that followed, Rachel continued to build her life, piece by piece. She moved into her own apartment in Flagstaff, a small space filled with light and plants, where she could feel safe and independent. She completed her online courses and began taking on freelance design projects, slowly rebuilding her career. She even started hiking again, though always with others and never in the Tonto National Forest. She chose trails that were open and well-traveled, places where she could enjoy the beauty of nature without the weight of memory pressing down on her. The case of the person who held her captive remained unsolved. Detective Larson retired in 2022, but before he left the force, he ensured that the case was handed over to a younger detective who promised to keep it active. The trail cameras stayed in place, and every so often, there would be a sighting, a shadow in the trees, a figure moving through the dusk, but nothing that could be confirmed or pursued. Rachel accepted that she might never know who had taken those 3 years from her, and that the person responsible might never face justice. It was a hard truth, but it was one she had learned to live with. What mattered more was that she had survived, that she had found a way to reclaim her life, and that she had turned her pain into something that could help others. In 2023, Rachel published a short memoir about her experience, working closely with Dr. Fletcher to ensure that it was honest but also respectful of her own healing process. The book was not a bestseller, but it reached the people it needed to reach: survivors, families, advocates, and those who worked in mental health and law enforcement. Rachel received letters from readers all over the country, people who thanked her for sharing her story, who said it had given them hope or helped them understand their own trauma. She read every letter, and she responded to as many as she could, finding purpose in the connection. On a quiet afternoon in the fall of that year, Rachel returned to the Highline Trail one final time. She went alone, though she told her father where she was going and promised to check in every hour. She walked the trail slowly, taking in the sights and sounds, letting herself feel whatever came up without trying to control it. When she reached the clearing where she had stopped with her father years earlier, she sat down on the same rock and looked out at the valley. The forest was still there, vast and indifferent, just as it had always been. But Rachel was different. She had walked into these trees once as a young woman looking for peace, and she had been swallowed by them, lost for 3 years in darkness and fear. But she had come out the other side, scarred but whole, and she had refused to let the experience destroy her. She had fought for every step of her recovery, and she had won. As the sun began to set, Rachel stood and turned back toward the trailhead. She did not look over her shoulder. She did not need to. The forest was behind her now, and ahead of her was the rest of her life, uncertain and difficult, but hers to live. And that, more than anything, was enough.